The worst part about being called a spy is, like, you can't just be like, "No," because that's what a spy would say, so you're just like, there's no good way to respond to, "You're a spy."
It's kind of like a very high level way of somebody saying like you're being defensive. It's like, no, I'm not being defensive.
No, exactly, yeah, it's like, No, of course not, like, I teach 3rd grade, here's my, my ID."
So we're here.
Hey.
We are in a country that many people believe exists. You, however, have been in countries that many people don't believe exist.
Right, and the key thing there is, like, belief as to whether or not you actually believe a country exists or not, 'cause, obviously right now there's a lot of turmoil based on, like, what country gets a space on the map and how that space on the map actually gets there. So I spent, about a year, almost a year and a half, just living in unrecognized nations to kind of try and figure out, like, what a country is in the first place, and, I actually think I got further away from that answer, so, deeply unsuccessful at that job.
Well, tell me a little bit about what you did discover, whether or not it brought you clarity about what a country actually is. What did you learn about the human project of countrying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good way to think about it too, because it's like one of the key takeaways is just that it's kind of a dumb sentiment, but it keeps holding true. It's just like it's made up. A country is made up, and the more I thought about it, though, is like because that's a sort of unsatisfying way of looking at whatever country you're from. Because of course these are deeply important narratives that people have lived for and died for. But I think the thing that I kind of came around to is that just because your country is this sort of shared consensus reality that just happens to occupy a certain space on the globe doesn't mean that that's not deeply important because a narrative is something that allows us to interoperate with one another. So, I mean, I guess I can sort of start from the beginning as to like
Please.
why I got interested in unrecognized countries in the first place, which like I'm consistently surprised why people will be like, "Oh, like why would you do that?" I'm like, "Why wouldn't you do that?" And then I realized that's a bit odd. So I was, I guess it was in 2016. I was working as a geopolitical analyst. I was an intern. And mostly I was writing about warfare, terrorism, some economics and trade stuff, which is interesting work for the right type of brain, I think. But it also is sort of deeply depressing at a certain point. Like, at least in my estimation, like it made me like the worst guy to sit next to at a bar, like ever, because I was just like, "How's work going? Oh, these missiles. Oh, what, did you know about the missiles?" It's like you can only talk about like missiles and random World War I treaties that nobody seems to care about. And so the work was interesting because you get to like really dial down deep into certain areas of the globe. And my area was the northern part of Iraq during the time of the Islamic State. So I was specifically focused on the Kurdish region, which is called Iraqi Kurdistan or the Kurdish Regional Government. And there was a time that they were about to vote democratically on whether or not they could break away from the Republic of Iraq. And I just kept thinking, well, like that would be a fascinating thing to go and see. And fortunately, I was fired from that job as a geopolitical analyst, and immediately started Googling for jobs in Iraqi Kurdistan, which I got really quickly. It was shockingly easy to become a 3rd grade teacher in Erbil. So like put in an application, and then like 3 weeks later, I was in Erbil, which is the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan.
Had you taught elementary school before that?
I did, yeah, yeah. So I was previously like a Peace Corps volunteer in northern Albania, and so I taught high school and ran a mobile library for really young kids. And then when I came home from that, I was working in special education for a couple of years. So like I know my way around a 3rd and 4th grade classroom. I mean, it was shockingly similar to a classroom in the United States. Like, I was actually really surprised at kind of how many like Western artifacts were just there. Like my my kids were just like constantly talking about like KFC and Jake Paul, and they were like, oh, you're from Los Angeles, Mr. Eric. Like, do you know Jake Paul? And I was like, yeah, totally. He's my neighbor. And so, but I was there, to be a third grade teacher, but also to see what it was like in a country that was attempting to vote itself free of another country. And I thought this was a kind of wild thing to occur, but it's actually kind of the rule rather than the exception. I can't remember the exact number, but I think since like the fall of the Soviet Union, there's been like over 30 countries that have sprung into existence. So new countries are getting created all of the time. And I mean, I know from an American perspective, you think of your nation as like this monolithic thing that will never go anywhere. And that's just not the case. So I thought it was really exciting to be in a place that was attempting to free itself from the federal Iraqi government.
Yeah.
And it was a big sort of exciting time to be there, and then it became very cautious as we approached the referendum. And the referendum came, and there was a sort of lack of international support, and they voted themselves free with, I want to say, like 92%.
You said 92%.
Yeah, is it 92%? All right, thanks. I'm fact checked by myself. So it's like 92%, and so in a world where we think of democracy as the sort of end all be all, it's like, well, of course you had democratic consent, and the mandate says, well, now you're a country. And that's just not the case in the rest of the world,
Yeah.
because oftentimes, might makes right, and the only vote that matters is the one that has an army on the other end of it. So,
Yeah, I was really struck thinking about the ways, we talk about the state having a monopoly of violence.
Yeah.
Of course, there might be the denomination question, the what is your currency, and in what ways does your currency create certain inevitable allies. You also then talk about this idea of shared memory that you were sort of touching on. What I was struck by the countries that don't exist that you traveled to is there, in many cases, attempted countries that exist within countries that are recognized, but that there's perhaps fractures or openings for this type of turbulence to emerge.
Yeah, and I think that like the when you sort of get down to brass tacks, like the art, as they say, I don't know who they are, but they said it at one point. The art of statecraft is the art of generating consent amongst the governed, right? And when you think about, like, if that's the overall strategy, the tactics to do that really determine how the government interacts with its people, right? So you can generate consent really quickly by putting a gun to somebody's head. It's like, okay, well, I believe that you exist. Or you can generate consent through democratic processes that are, open and transparent. There's trade-offs to both of them, right? If we're sticking in a like cold-blooded geopolitical mindset, which let's do it for a second. One of the trade-offs of being a violent autocracy that's going to put that gun to your head to ensure that you believe the story of the nation is that you're essentially speaking to your people in a grammar that will then be how they speak back to you. So that's why violent regimes can get overthrown with violence. And the bargain of democracy is basically like, okay, if you have a small amount of buy-in saying that your voice is represented in this national story, well, then you're not going to destroy a system that you had some buy-in in creating. And so that's kind of the bargain of democracy versus violent autocracy. And of course, there's shades of gray in all of these. Like there's a wide spectrum of the ways to create a government, but everything has a trade-off. And so when Western powers, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which is kind of where Iraq got its borders, Turkey got its current borders, and Kurdistan has no borders currently. When they were drawing lines fairly arbitrarily across areas that they just wanted to have as a part of their sphere of influence, they didn't actually care much about what familiarity and what affinity groups existed within those borders. And so it gave rise to a good deal of violent conflict that we're still seeing today. There were the referendum on independence in Kurdistan in 2017. It was one of four different times that the Kurds have tried to have an independent state. And I think the longest one I want to say was the Kingdom of Kurdistan, and it lasted for about 2 years.
Mm.
And then there was one in, I think it was northwestern Iran, called the Mahabad Republic, and then it only lasted for like 9 months with the support of the Soviet Union.
Mm.
So you have transnational powers reaching into governments that are that appear on the globe, trying to gin up dissent to potentially weaken the sphere of influence that dominant power has.
Mm. There's so much that we're talking about that I want to come back to,
Yeah.
but I also don't want to get ahead of things, and I want to understand you a little better so that we understand your journey through
Sure.
these nations. So let's start back at the beginning. Maybe not when you're born, but somewhere in your formative
Year was
years.
1987.
Yeah.
Santa Monica, California.
But a sense of what would ultimately animate you to undertake this task, which by your own admission, few people undertake other than journalists, humanitarian aid workers. And you were undertaking, at one point you were an ambassador of a country that doesn't exist.
Right.
So I'd love to get a little bit more context for who were you as a young person, and where do we see the early seeds of these interests? And then I want to particularly surface your open source intelligence brief background, which you referenced at the beginning of the conversation, but you also reference a particular episode that really, I don't know, captures why that's such a beleaguering job.
Yeah.
And so I want to pit stop there for a second, because I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about open source intelligence. And so anyway, if you could recap formative experiences that led you to be this journalist and translator of countries that don't exist, with a pit stop in open source intelligence.
Yeah, sure. So I was always a writer, and I think that is kind of the main driving force, right? So and I went to theater school, which quickly upon leaving theater school, you're like, oh, why did I do that? That was an educational error. Actually, it ends up being really helpful in terms of interacting with other cultures, just because you learn so well how to be uncomfortable for long periods of time. So I was a playwright in school, and I wanted to keep writing, but I kept trying to figure out how my writing could be the most useful possible form that it could take. And so while I was in the Peace Corps, so this was 2011, 2013, I was living in northern Albania on the border of Kosovo as a Peace Corps volunteer. And I kept doing plays while I was there. And I wrote what we called live theater blog. And this was back in like 2011 to 2013. So it was like I would write a monthly play that would be performed back in Los Angeles, sort of like a blog about my experience in Peace Corps, more or less travel writing that was performed. And then the funds came to Albania, and then we started a mobile library with it. So I sort of started making this like weird, gentle transition into like nonfiction writing. And I also noticed that by telling stories, by sort of harvesting this like raw material of people's experiences, you could actually generate some really cool change that was happening on the ground. And at the time, I was reading guys like Christopher Hedges and Sebastian Junger, and I was just thinking, there's a way for me to be more helpful, given like this weird set of skills that I've acquired, which is like, oh, I'm interested in history, and I'm interested in traveling, and I like different cultures, and I like spending time in them. I have a good capacity for being deeply uncomfortable for long periods of time, physically, spiritually, and in all ways that one can be uncomfortable. And, at a certain point, I was like, well, this all leads me to wanting to spend time in places in the world that are maybe misunderstood, because we're getting one version from the news or from wherever. And my understanding of that was just that that simply wasn't the case, or that there was a lot more nuance there. So I wanted to spend time in the places that typically made Americans fairly uncomfortable, and also made me very uncomfortable at the same time. I tend to be like a fairly paranoid and anxious person. That is also somewhat frustrating for me because it's like I don't want to be paranoid of something I know nothing about. So at the point that I become super like, unreasonably afraid of something, I'm like, I'm just going to research this thing until I know everything about it. Which led me to spending some time in the Middle East. I was in Lebanon, and then eventually got connected with a geopolitical writer, and he was giving me various people to go interview in Beirut, and I was like, "Wow, this is really interesting. How can I keep writing about this stuff?" And he was like, "Okay, well, I have an internship program, and you can write for me." And I was like, "Cool, what do we do?" It's like, "You're an open source intelligence analyst." And I was like, "Great, what is that?" And the idea is basically you're taking information that's publicly available. In the case that, uh, so in my working situation, we were just looking at this huge dump of data from local newspapers, from the reported news and the legacy media system, and trying to figure out where something relevant would happen geopolitically. And so we had this predictive model for the world that was, looking at various points of power, various places that, a conflict could erupt. We called them fault lines and flashpoints. And these are generally based off of geography or where historically power would jump into these conflicts that would change the relationships globally. So these are areas like, the Hindu Kush, so, consistently been some conflicts there that have given way to new countries being created, and old rivalries, starting up again. Areas like, the Red Sea, where, currently there's some conflict. The Middle East is fraught with this. The Balkans, obviously, I've spent a lot of time in the Balkans at this point. So the way that people tend to remember conflict in the Balkans is like, oh man, that happened in, 1489, but it might as well have been yesterday. And so we would look at what was happening in the news, and we would contextualize that with what had happened historically, and then dial down into the specifics of like, well, is it possible that this turns into a broader conflict? Is it possible that this becomes the match that lights the barn on fire? And actually, one of the most incredible things about that job was realizing kind of how resilient the world actually is. That oftentimes there are these low simmering conflicts that I think from back in the States, we're looking at them on the news being like, okay, this is the thing, this is it. It's going to be World War III now in like, 2 weeks time. When in fact, that's not usually the way that works because there is a reticence for direct conflict.
Mm.
But of course, when it happens, and you have to look really carefully at these things to predict what might happen next. And so that's what got me interested in the Kurdish region. I was looking at open source intelligence, and somebody had sent across to the our I think we were using Skype at the time or some group chat thing. This was pre
How
Slack.
passe.
Yeah, I know, pre Slack. That's our operational security was awesome. There was a beheading video that had come through, and it was, I believe it was produced by the Islamic State, and it was coming out through their. They had a magazine at the time. It was called Dabik or Dabik. I can't remember how it's pronounced. Hopefully, Islamic State, don't be mad at me. Anyway, like there was this beheading video that somebody had to analyze, and I could kind of tell that like I wasn't doing very well at the job, and so I was like, I'll do it. I'll watch that beheading video. I had to watch it a bunch of times, and the goal of watching it was it could have been relevant because it was produced and the voiceover was in Farsi. Now, typically, the area of influence that the Islamic State was attempting to gather up was Arabic speaking, and so the relevance there could have been, well, does this indicate that the Islamic State is now trying to threaten Tehran and move into the space that's controlled by Iran? And specifically on the video, soldiers were being beheaded that were wearing the insignia of the popular mobilization units, who are Shia-backed militia fighters in Iraq. And so after, a dozen times of watching this beheading video, I was like, this is not the job for me. And then I also realized, as I was looking at the maps on my wall, because I love maps. I think anybody who travels a lot just deeply appreciates how sacred a map is. And I was looking at it, and I realized that my eyes weren't going to a place that I wanted to go anymore. Like, they weren't going to the Azores or the Galapagos or the Arctic, all these places that I wanted to travel to. Instead, they were going towards areas of conflict that I was looking at, and worrying about what the next flashpoint, what the next fault line would be. And I realized I didn't really like the world anymore. I was deeply afraid of the world. And that was this and then it was like, I had to get up pretty early in the morning to do this. So like I watched like this beheading video for like an hour and a half. And then it gave my little brief on the group call, and they're like, "Okay, that's irrelevant. You don't need to write about that." And I was like, "Well, just watch that beheading video for nothing?" And I like walked to my local coffee shop. That was like, "How's your morning?" I'm like, "Bad." It's really bad. But after thinking about it a bit, I was thinking about the Kurdish region and the idea that for the first time in history there might be a Kurdish state that exists on the map. And to me, it was a story not about conflict, but it was about the world coming together and a certain kind of justice happening for the first time in a long time. Because, of course, if you look back at the news anywhere, you just see, a litany of atrocity. And I wanted to like the world again. And by studying nonviolent, democratic creation of a nation state, it was quite exciting. And so yeah, that led me to going and getting a job as a third grade teacher in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Quite an inversion.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, it's not to say that there wasn't conflict while I was out there. There certainly was. After the referendum, the Iraqi government shut down the airspace over Iraqi Kurdistan.
Which posed some problems for your personal life.
Massive. Yeah. My girlfriend at the time was a Fulbright scholar in Bulgaria. So I was supposed to meet her for, Christmas and New Year's. And, it's a weird call to have with your partner where it's just like, I'd love to come, but like the Baghdad shut down the airspace, and I guess let's Skype. But I wasn't gonna miss that. So I had the opportunity to leave over land. There's a fairly lengthy bus ride that you could take from Erbil, where I was living, across the border to Turkey. So I did that and spent, Christmas in Bulgaria. And then we wanted to spend New Year's back in Istanbul. And this is where I kind of like fucked everything up. So we took this train ride from Sofia, Bulgaria to Istanbul, which is a great train ride and everybody should do it. Just don't talk about Kurdistan if you're doing it. And we got taken off the train to, show our passports and stuff. And it's like 3 a.m. and the Turkish border guard is like, "Oh, so like, where do you live?" And then I was like, "Kurdistan." And just like partially ruined my life for that exact moment, but it did give way to like some more positive things. Essentially what happened was I was detained along with my girlfriend by the Turkish government and, well, by the border authorities. And we were interrogated for a good 2 hours. And it was like, I was not a smart person in traveling through Turkey at this point, because I had just been to a Kurdish rally and my camera probably had like 1,000 images of just hyper nationalistic Kurdish imagery on it. And so they're going through my phone and then they go through my camera and they're like, "So you're a spy?" And I'm like, "No, no, the worst part about being called a spy is like you can't just be like no, because that's what a spy would say. So you're just like, there's no good way to respond to "you're a spy."
It's kind of like a very high level way of somebody saying like you're being defensive. It's like, no, I'm not being defensive.
No, exactly. Yeah, it's like, no, of course not. Like I teach third grade. Here's my my ID.
Which I gather from the book that being an elementary or any type of teacher as an American citizen in a lot of these regions is perceived that you would be a spy because it reads as a good cover story.
Yeah, and I mean, frankly, like I've lived in Albania for about like 3 years straight now, and even my friends still think I'm a spy. So it's like it doesn't go away.
I mean, the long con is that you are a spy,
Yeah.
and the book is now further distancing you, buying your distance. That in fact you're just this journalist.
That's right. Yeah. Wink. Don't give away my long con, man. So that ended up getting me banned from Turkey, and fortunately they didn't put us in jail, which was great, super cool of them. They just like kicked us out of the border, and they're like, okay, well walk back to Bulgaria, which really kind of torpedoed the whole book, because the idea was, well, I'm gonna write about a country becoming a country. I'm gonna find out what a country is by seeing a country being made. And at that point, I was like, okay, well, within 24 hours, I had lost my job in Erbil. I had lost my apartment. I had a couple grand that I had stuck in my boot because they just paid us in cash in Iraq, or Iraqi Kurdistan, I should say. And I was like, well, I don't quite know what to do. Like, I didn't have like that many shirts, so I was just trying to figure out a way to get back to Erbil, and I called the American consulate in Turkey, and the foreign service officer was very serious with me, and she was like, "Look, we already have 2 or 3 Americans detained there right now, and we can't do anything. Don't ever go through that border again." I was like, "Okay, well, I gotta figure out another way to do this book." And so I decided to look around at some other unrecognized nations. Obviously, I've spent so much time in the greater Albanian area, and I used to live on the border of Kosovo. So I realized that Kosovo was having its 10-year anniversary of independence, like just right around the corner. So I moved to Kosovo, and I was in Pristina, and I decided to write, if the Kurdish referendum had failed, right? If they were unable to actually make a country, what happens if there's a country that was ostensibly successful in creating independence? Now, 100 countries recognize Kosovo's independence, but not everybody. And so 10 years on, like, what does that actually look like? And one of the things that I kept learning was that the real fight actually begins after you gain a sort of marginal independence, and that this comes at a cost of free movement of the people, the economic degradation of the state, the lack of institutions that have been built because it was in warfare. So we think of revolutions oftentimes as like these glorious things where like we get to wave new flags and then suddenly everything's great, but that's not the case. Like the Les Mis musical version is not the version. It's a really hard fight, and it's one that continues to be fought to this day.
Can you really quickly outline, just so I think listeners will be surprised to know how many unrecognized nations, or rather recognized to varying degrees, this category you've defined as countries that don't exist. Just ballpark, how many are there in the world?
Oh man, I can't. I mean, I would say,
or maybe a minimum. What's a minimum amount?
Oh, easily 20 that I know of. And some that are appearing and disappearing all the time. And then, not only are there sort of like ethnic majority states that are attempting to free themselves from larger powers, like Kurdistan, but there's also just kind of trying to be delicate about this, wackadoo projects that people just make up sometimes. So like Sealand is an oil derrick that's off of the coast of the United Kingdom, and it ostensibly gained its independence in 1967, and they're a principality, but it's just a random oil derrick. Since I get emails about this stuff all the time, I just heard about Slow Jamistan, which is a new country started by a slow jam loving DJ outside of San Diego. I've yet to go to Slow Jamistan, but
sounds like you need to put it on your list.
And that's the thing about nation building is like it runs this gamut between these sort of strange projects in the idea of nation building, and then truly heartbreaking and hard fought independence movements where, again, when we're talking about the art of generating consent amongst the governed, if you don't have a lot of people to govern, you can just say what you want. But if you have a history that has borne the brunt of a lot of personal tragedy and has a lot of ancestral trauma, then it becomes almost like necessary for the fight to continue. So that slow jam love and DJ in the San Diego desert, like he doesn't have to contend with, a violent history, and he can, put on a funny hat and say, like, get your passport stamped here. But on the surface level, it kind of looks like the same project
Mm.
as building a country. And of course, as we progress into the future, which I think we'll talk about, the idea of nation states is going to get even more spongy as we
Absolutely.
go on.
Yeah, one thing that comes up in my own research, and of course I'm nowhere near as researched, and I have way less travel and direct experience with this, but um, through the research and the questions that I'm asking in thinking about post reality and what the post modernity paradigm of reality is, it just becomes very clear that we're now in a moment when this consensus, this consent of the governed, um, is starting to change. And different grudges and historical claims on land, historical claims on ideas are emerging at a time when the trust that the American government will be able to meaningfully play, whether you think it's a good cop or bad cop, sort of depends on where you sit, but be able to play, police officer of the world. And so we're starting to see a lot of the fallout of this, and then that's intersecting with emerging technologies. And you sit in right in the middle of that. How are you thinking about the way that the idea of the nation state is changing, is possibly under attack, but also, in some ways maybe refortifying in like retrenching certain types of nationalism? And also, how does that connect to thinking about the ways that technology offers a possibility of nations and nation states that are not necessarily strictly pegged to a particular landmass?
Yeah, I think I can actually broadly like talk about all these things with the example of Liberland, right? My next stop on my stateless journey was a place called Liberland, and strangely, like I found out about Liberland from a journalist that I met in Iraq, and I was trying to get in with a group of journalists so I could gain access to to various things that were going on around the city. Because as a third grade teacher, I didn't have any sort of credentials. I couldn't just be like, "Hey, Mr. Eric, so I get to talk with the president now, right?" And so we were chatting for a while, and he was like, "Look, if you're interested in unrecognized nations, you should check out Liberland." And I was like, "What's Liberland?" And he's like, "Well, it's a libertarian micronation that's funded off of cryptocurrencies. It's on an empty island in the Balkans." And I was like, "That doesn't get me any closer to figuring out what Liberland is." And he's like, "Okay, well, I will give you the president's contact information, and then maybe if you're in the neighborhood, you can give him a shout." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, that sounds great. I've never had the contact information of a head of state before, so let's do this." And so while I was on my stateless journey, I didn't think that I had anything to lose by just like shooting off an email to the president of Liberland every once in a while. And I bothered them sufficiently to the point that they were like, "Okay, well, if you can make it here by the date of our 30-year anniversary, you can meet us." And at this point, I kind of assumed that this was like a Burning Man commune type of deal, that like there'd just be a bunch of people slacklining and fire dancing, and that was their country. But as it turned out, it's a pretty serious endeavor to take a place of unclaimed land, which is an island in the Danube River, and turn it into a recognized nation state. So the reason that it's an empty island is because after the fall of Yugoslavia in the 90s, uh, basically Croatia and Serbia were like, nobody wants this island, so it's no man's land. And a Bitcoiner from the Czech Republic decides, we can create a country here. at this point, I had no idea about cryptocurrencies or how technology was sort of allowing the nation state to be reconceptualized, right? And I didn't quite grasp that there was this huge relationship between the pool of wealth controlled by an area and the people and the land that it occupies on the map. But then, you sort of run yourself through that thought experiment. What is your country if not a pool of wealth and the ability to exert violent force on others? Like it's not just songs, it's not just like road systems. It's a pool of wealth maintained largely in one geographic location. And so the bargain that the Liberlanders were making is like, well, now we have decentralized currency. We can place that on land and we can create this libertarian government and assume that anybody who is here, if we sort of keep our hands off of them, they will make a functioning nation state. And that's what they're attempting to do currently. So I ended up meeting the Liberlanders at what turned out to be a cryptocurrency conference. And I just wanted to meet the president because, first president I'd ever gotten in contact with. And as it turns out, the Liberlanders couldn't actually step foot on the island at that moment because the Croatian authorities were keeping them off of the island pending a legal battle that they were having. Croatia was basically like, you can't make a country on our border. And Liberland was like, yes, we can. So the bargain that they had made was like, well, we're just going to take a bunch of houseboats and just like look at the island. And Croatian authorities were like, okay, well, we're going to send a bunch of police boats out there to make sure you don't step on the island. So it just ended up being this sort of flotilla of crypto nerds just going out to look at an empty island, which is really fascinating after, having spent the majority of a year in places where violent revolutions have gone through, referendums have come and gone and yielded no results, and no new lines were being drawn on a map. And then you have Liberland, which is, a bunch of crypto nerds on some houseboats in the middle of the Danube River saying that they're going to make a country and ostensibly succeeding. And it's like, how is this thing like that thing? And part of it has to do with a state is a connection of a story to the land at this point in history, right? And so the moment that somebody lives their life and dies their death on that land, then the story of that land ends up being sort of as immutable as like the color of the sky, right? Like the moment that you move a Russian into another area that I was in called Transnistria, and they have generations of Russians there, suddenly that becomes a Russian area. Saddam Hussein in Kirkuk decided to embark on this process of Arabization of Kirkuk because Kirkuk was oil rich, right? So he was attempting to generate consent amongst the governed by saying, no, this is our story, it's not your story. But if there's no story that's already on that land, in the case of, an empty island in the middle of the Danube River, it's up for grabs. And so it seems kind of goofy to just make a country using cryptocurrencies. But as you project it forward, you actually see that this has been predicted in a lot of literature that talks about geopolitics. So books like The Sovereign Individual, or what Balaji is writing about right now, The Network State, this is kind of a couple of steps forward as the nation state starts to lose its power as a mode of control and a catalyst for growth in the world.
Mm.
And also, I think that one of the things that's crazy to think about is the fact that the nation state hasn't been around forever. It was started in the 1600s, and then before that, you have basically faith-based empires. And before that, you have power-based empires. And then you just keep going back. And of course, there are kingdoms and fiefdoms and dukedoms within there. But like, eventually, we're just like, hanging out in caves being like, we need to get together because we got to kill this bison. So the question is like, what happens now? And then like, what does the transition phase look like? Which is, I think, what we're in right now. As you mentioned, the West is, broadly speaking, the West is losing power, and we're moving towards what some people are calling a multipolar world. And we see a couple of different things that fall out of this, right? We see a huge rise in state-based nationalism. And well, like, why is that rise in state-based nationalism happening at the exact same time that the nation state is sort of crumbling in its ability to do what a nation state should do, which is provide services for its people, provide for the common defense, and create a galvanizing sense of identity? It's like that identity portion is becoming far more powerful while the services rendered by the state are actually becoming weaker. And I think that the reason for that is that you cling to the things that you know, and generationally, we as Americans, we're clinging to this sort of golden ideal of the greatness of our country, which is, I think, if you track back where people talk about this, like, this great American dream, it hovers somewhere around like post World War II era. And there's a totally great reason for that, right? Like, after World War I, we got the passage to the Atlantic Ocean, and suddenly we became a sea-based trading power, right? We start expanding across our continent, and we're buffered with a bunch of lakes and a bunch of deserts on the bottom, and two oceans. So as Peter Zahan, how do you pronounce his name?
I think you got it.
Peter Zahan. As Peter Zahan says, we're I love how he puts it. We've got a crunchy exterior and a gooey interior, right? So it's hard to invade us. And then we became, a dominant shipping power and manufacturing power after World War II. So after we drop the atomic bomb, suddenly we get the Pacific Passage too. So now we are the majority manufacturer in the world because, of course, all the manufacturing infrastructure in Europe is destroyed by World War II. And we're also the majority shipping apparatus in the world. So you kind of have to buy from us, and you kind of had to get it to you by us. And so we have this enormous jump in wealth and a robust skills-based middle class that is eventually becoming like this powerhouse, this global powerhouse. And the reason that we become, the world police, as you put it, is because we have to hold on to those structures that kept us in power, namely the naval power, right? So the deal that we struck with the world is we'll police the oceans and allowed trade and globalization to proliferate throughout the world. And so we created this enormous globalized force, but at the same time, we had to hold on to it. And that is why we proliferated our military apparatus throughout the world too, because we were attempting to create this world that everybody could do business on and we could take a tidy profit from.
Well, and we could, make this thing called the dollar the most powerful force on the planet.
Yeah, right. And I mean, it's like, from a cold-blooded geopolitical point of view, it's a great deal, right? Like, it's a really good deal because the investment of blood and treasure that we had to make for World War II and World War I was pretty minimal. And so that's why I think that it's important to have some cultural empathy for people who are like, I remember it being better. And it's like, well, of course, like, it was. Like, we were powerful. And we still are quite powerful. I mean, we're remarkably powerful. But the apparatus to continue and maintain that is dependent on constant growth. And that growth now is not beholden to the borders of the United States. It can go everywhere. Capital is going to seek labor for the lowest price possible. And that oftentimes means that the work is going outside of our country. So that's why we have Foxconn factories all over the world that are producing the goods that have been conceptualized and ostensibly made in the United States, but now they're being built elsewhere. And so the economy is decentralized.
We're also seeing that play out even, everybody's talking about generative AI, and there were a lot of exposés over the past couple of years demonstrating that actually the data laborers were not based in the U.S. to clean that data such that we could, end up in a position where we have these magical generative systems. There's probably a lot to get into, but that's not really the point of it. I just bring it up to kind of carry your point.
Well, and I think that, so what's sort of projected as what will happen as the nation state becomes less relevant. It's able to do its job less well, taking the sort of the romance out of patriotism and nationalism. Uh, Simply put, nation states will be able to do their jobs less well in the future. Meanwhile, we'll have this class of individuals who are largely knowledge-based individuals who have enormous access to information and the power to create products, digital and otherwise, that make them enormously powerful and enormously wealthy. But that's only like, one Steve Jobs rather than an entire assembly line from Henry Ford, because now it's more about data than it is about atoms, right? We're not pulling atoms out of the ground and rearranging them. We're exporting that to other countries. And so this is something they call like the barbell economy, where it's like on one end, you'll have this carrying capacity of sort of brute laborers that are just, working with atoms instead of data. And then on the other end, you'll have this enormously wealthy elite class, which have more in common with one another, regardless of where they were born. And so this is called affinity groups by a couple of people. So the idea of an affinity group is that, like, well, if you're a billionaire, you probably have more in common with other billionaires than you do with somebody who is maybe born in your country, but not making $1 billion. And so the question becomes, well, as they depart from the services of the nation state, what's to stop them from creating their own digital nation state?
Mm. Let me ask you something, because I think there's like a first principles-ish question in there of like, do you think the nation state is a viable model still? Or rather, the nation state as it has been constructed. So let's leave aside what the nation state could become. And let's look at the way that the nation state exists now today in a classical, like it hits the minimum spec of shared memory, land, monopoly of violence, all the basic factors. Do you think that's a viable model? Is it the best that we can do?
I mean, I think historically, nothing lasts forever. And I think that one of the things that you have to look at is like, how much does it keep meeting that minimum spec? There's so much conspiratorial thinking about like, oh, there's going to be one world government, and it's like in some ways that is already the case, right? We have enormously wealthy people who are directing the lives and welfare of many, many people, regardless of where they live on the world. But will the nation state as we know it continue to exist, in 100 years from now? I mean, I don't think so. But that's it's a big claim to make, and in a way, I like it makes me really sad to say that. Like, I think that the more noble parts of the nation state as it is based around the fact that we can all collaborate based upon us sort of believing this one story, right? And we need fictions to collaborate around. We need these fictions to collaborate around. We need to be able to have something that is beyond wealth to make us interoperate with one another, because we can do incredible things when we believe the same thing. But on the flip side, we can also do horrifying things when we believe the same thing. The thing that I find both frightening and somewhat hopeful is that the human mind and the human heart has this ability to throw the human being behind believing in an abstraction. And when we believe in that abstraction, we can operate on the same playing field as other human beings. But of course, this gets perverted sometimes. It's like, as an American, do you like freedom? It's like, yeah, of course I like freedom. It's like, great, we're invading Iraq. Wait, why? Well, freedom. And it's like the person who controls that abstraction is the person who pulls that lever, right? And so while there are these high-minded ideals that everybody wants to get behind, freedom, peace, equality, it matters most who determines what those actually mean, boots on the ground.
Let's talk a little bit about blockchain and Bitcoin.
In one respect, you can use it for greater transparency. Potentially, it can be used to refine voting, which would be great. um, maintaining records, all those things are great. Like I tend to think that in blockchain, the more unsexy the use case, the more useful it tends to be.
Mm,
And I think a lot of those things are really great.
mm,
However, I think that what cryptocurrencies allow you to do and what blockchain technology allows you to do is add a layer of fungibility or tradability on top of discrete activities, right? So we were just talking about Sweatcoin, which not a paid advertisement for Sweatcoin, but apparently it's like some crypto that like it's like if you walk a bunch, you get crypto or something. Um, again, it seems like okay, well that's a interesting use case. I don't know how well it works. But what if we put that on steroids, right? Like let's say you're an Amazon employee and they want to ensure that you are the best possible person at your job. Now they already have some analytics on how you perform, right? And let's say they figure out, oh man, our employees who get 8 hours of sleep a night, they're X percentage better by whatever metrics they choose, right? So suddenly they give you a small payout of like a redeemable cryptocurrency based upon your personal activities. And then they say, okay, well, it's even better if they like go for a little jog. So like you have an elevated heart rate for 30 minutes before you start work. Great. We'll give you a little bit of payout for that. Like those things seem fairly innocuous, but if you keep pushing that line, what you end up with is a sort of crypto dictatorship, which is all carrot and no stick. And so I think that there's an important conversation to be had around how much can you incentivize somebody to do an activity before they're not really free to not do that activity.
mm.
Typically dictatorships are the all stick no carrot model. From what I've heard of history, it's a lot of sticks in various dictatorships. But if you have the ability to provide carrots through fungibility, then that still results in a lack of human freedom and a lack of agency on behalf of the person who is eating them carrots.
So this intersects, obviously, you referenced Balaji's network state
Yep.
idea earlier. Would you say that, well, first of all, could you describe that in a sentence? And then as a follow-up to that, would you say that the critique that you're making applies to his claims about the possibilities of the network state?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so network state in general, decentralized nation state, and so actually, I don't even know if you would call it a nation state. So it's a decentralized body that is diplomatically recognized. Because really, I mean, the dummy version of it is like to create a country, you kind of have to do two things, like declare and then get recognition. Declaring super easy. Shout out to Slow Jamistan. As far as I know, there's no diplomatic recognition of Slow Jamistan yet. We'll see what their military can do. But what is sort of predicted is this affinity group of highly powerful, highly wealthy individuals, so they can pool their resources, which include not just land but also attention, right? And by doing that, they can gain the consent of the world to say, okay, these people, even though they're located in various different locations, are a functioning nation state or a functioning state, a network state at this point. I think that's one way that it can happen. The nightmare scenario of this is basically you have this network state that exists through data and through communication and through the control of attention and privately held lands. But at the end of the day, you need to have physical resources that come into those areas. So I know Peter Thiel was like working on this seasteading movement. And so that's basically like, oh, all a bunch of billionaires go out to sea, we make our own nation. It's like Hunger Games, Gilligan's Island. One of the problems to this is getting resources out to your Gilligan's Island. at a certain point, especially if you're leveraging technology, you need to take atoms from the ground and you need to turn them into technology because, man can't eat ideas at this point. We'll see what happens. But what I think could potentially happen is I could see a future where there are network states that exist, created by these, highly wealthy affinity groups, and then there are land-based nation states for the rest of us, right? Where we become the lower end of that barbell economy that sort of act as the labor mechanism for network states. Like that's one future that I could see, and it certainly sounds pretty dystopian. But I I sort of try not to say like what future will be better or worse because ultimately it's going to be somewhere in the middle, right?
I mean, I don't mean to sound too. I don't want to bring down the vibe,
No, bring down the vibe.
but in many ways we're already living in a dystopia. Like what somebody might have imagined a dystopian future looking like 100 years ago. We see many aspects of that in society today. So, and I think we can be frank about that in our assessment of now, but also what possible good ideas, the whole notion of like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, how like there's a lot we can see in the idea of the network state that seems really positive. But to your point, if you're creating incentive structures and governance structures that ultimately just feed back into disempowering a populace, then it just feeds into the same cycle that it's ostensibly reacting against. You were an ambassador for a crypto nation or a crypto state, or I don't know if that's is that the right framing for it? A state?
I'll go as their former ambassador. I will say that is fine.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
100%. That's the official stance of me from being Liberland's ambassador, crypto
Excellent.
state.
Well, so tell me what some of the early experiments that you witnessed, because there's a moment in the book a little bit toward the end in Somaliland where some actual good happens because of crypto. But what were some of your experiences, spending time getting to know and understand Liberland, but also in this ambassadorial capacity you had as a Liberlandian in another foreign land?
Yeah, and I should explain my ambassador experience because it doesn't make it onto my LinkedIn for obvious reasons. So while I was on the crypto party boat, I met the Secretary of State for Liberland on the boat, and his name was Tom. And shout out Tom. And he asked, "Well, where's next on your stateless journey?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to Somaliland next, which is a autonomous area in northern Somalia. It sort of occupies the top half of the Horn of Africa." And he was like, "Well, we have an embassy there." And I was like, "That's weird." Cool. And he's like, "You want to stay at it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. I want to stay at your embassy." And I also couldn't afford staying anywhere else, so this worked out great. But eventually, like I had my ticket to Hargeisa, Somaliland, and I hadn't heard from them, and I was beginning to sweat profusely because you have a ticket to, Somaliland and nowhere to stay and a couple $100 to your name, and it's not looking good if you have like a ticket back in 6 weeks. I was like, where can I mop floors to just hang out there for a while? So eventually I got back in touch with the president of Liberland, and he was like, "Oh, well, like we lost our ambassador to Somaliland." And I was like, "Oh, shit, that means I probably can't stay anymore." And he's like, "Do you want to do that?" I was like, "What?" And he's like, "Do you want to be the ambassador from Liberland to Somaliland?" And I was like, "Yeah, so long as I can stay at the embassy." And that meant that I was staying in Somaliland, Hargeisa, Somaliland for, I think it was like 5, 6 weeks. And during that time, initially I was just giving like 2 tasks, and like the 2 tasks were like establish diplomatic relations with the government of Somaliland. And I was like, cool, got it, no problem. And then it was like also buy furniture for the embassy because it's empty. And it's like, okay, I can achieve these goals. And so I had a contact on the ground there. He's a Syrian property developer that was working in the area. He sort of connected me to a guy who's working in the political apparatus of Hargeisa, Abdul Rahman. Wonderful individual, really, really incredible man. And so through him, I was able to start meeting the vice president of Somaliland, which didn't think was going to be on my 2018 bingo card, but there it was. Uh, and so I walked in and I'm like, I guess I have to be an ambassador because like this is all made up, but like it's not to them. So like I gotta be ambassadorial. And I noticed really quickly, like, how as soon as I was sort of being treated with this deference of an ambassador, like, that I just became like this, like, political jargon spewing machine. And I was like, we at Liberland hope for the greater prosperity. I was just like, I was saying these things that I feel like I'd seen presidents in movies say. And I was like, where is this coming from? And it was just because I was being treated as if I had power and influence. And I never realized quite how like intoxicating that would be until I'm meeting with a vice president and talking about our strong diplomatic relations when like a week before I was sleeping on my girlfriend's couch in Sofia, Bulgaria. Things were going along seemingly fine in Somaliland, and I was interviewing other Somalilanders and learning more about the country. And then a cyclone blew through the nation, and power was knocked out, communications were knocked out, and I could get no information in for about a week, and then finally I found out that this Cyclone Sagar, had blown through and caused a lot of damage. And I got a call from the foreign secretary of Liberland. He was like, "Oh, this is like we're glad you're okay, and this is really good for our relations with Somaliland." And I was like, "Cool, why?" And they're like, "Well, we're gonna give diplomatic aid, and we're the first country to give diplomatic aid to Somaliland because we have a team on the ground." I was like, "That's awesome. Who's the team?" They're like, "That's you." I'm like, good. It's gonna be great. And so I'm like, what do I do? They're like, we're gonna give you money and then you have to figure out how to do an aid delivery out to the area that was most affected by Cyclone Sagar. And it's like, okay, the bank system in Somaliland is barely functioning. In fact, it's sort of famously not functioning very well. Like the system of money is done through banks and cell phones, but really they're moving around actual like stacks of depreciated Somali shillings. Like there's a guy with a motorbike who will take a stack and then send it to whoever that stack goes to because you texted it a guy. It's like basically reinventing the modern banking system, except instead of ones and zeros flying across the internet, it's guy on motorbike. And so I was like, well, that won't work. So how are we doing this? And they're like, we're going to send you Bitcoin. So I ended up getting $15,000 in Bitcoin sent to my contact there, who ended up just giving me $15,000 just handed to me in an office in Hargeisa, Somaliland, which was kind of a distressingly small amount of bills. Like I kind of assumed like, a payout like this would like involve a shiny briefcase or something, but it was just like an envelope. And so a portion of it I set aside for this aid delivery, and then a portion of it I set aside for buying furniture for the embassy, as was my other job. And so that was actually kind of a remarkable thing because you're like, okay, well, hash power by thousands and thousands of computers around the world has turned into Bitcoin, which could be transmitted from somebody's wallet somewhere in Europe to somebody's wallet in a burgeoning nation state that doesn't really have a functioning financial infrastructure. That can be turned into fiat currency, which can be turned into food to help people who are actually in need. Like that actually is kind of a remarkable thing to happen, especially when the modern banking system is based upon, who's in power and keeping those that we don't want in power out of power, right? One of the first things that the global powers will do when they're trying to get another nation state to fall in line is say, well, you can't do an international banking anymore. Like you're not on SWIFT anymore. So So, kick rocks, Russia. And it's like, well, that's still like, regardless of how you feel about that, like, that's still one nation leveraging an enormous amount of power, or even a group of nations leveraging an enormous amount of power over other nations. Now, you may think it's beneficial now, but like one of the big rules for uh, creating a workable order of governance in the world is to say, I'm making a system, and now I'm making that system so that my enemy can run that system, right? So it has to, any tool that you use as a tool offensively or defensively is going to be used against you at some point. So creating a more level playing field where there isn't one dominant power that can control the status of a type of currency is potentially a better thing. Of course, it just depends on who's in control and how they use that tool. So I thought it was pretty cool that we were able to transmit money into Somaliland, and then I think we bought like 7 tons of food and then brought it out to the middle of the desert in Somalia to give it to nomads. But it was also a really interesting moment there too, because I was talking with my friend Abdul Rahman, like, okay, so we've sent the food out there, so it's good, right? And he's like, oh yeah, and then you have to go out there and give it to them. I'm like, no, we sent the food, so the food's out there. We gave it to them, right? And he's like, I know, but like, you're a diplomat. You have to go give it to them to take pictures. I was like, oh, right. Like, it's not about humanitarian aid so much as it is about soft power, right?
Mm.
And that's where the rubber meets the road. Again, back to that idea of generating consent amongst the governed, you also have to generate consent amongst your peers or your near peers in terms of the nation states that you want to do business with. And one way of doing that is doing favors, giving diplomatic aid, is making sure that they recognize that you exist by doing things for them when they're unable to do them for themselves.
Mm.
And so it felt morally difficult while I was out there essentially for a photo op amongst people who had just been through this horrifying experience. And like, on the one hand, I'm very, very happy that we were able to get them food. But on the other hand, I was like, this is also a political gesture.
Mm.
And by being the ambassador of this political gesture, I'm just a part of this machine of building a nation state.
Mm.
And whether that's right or wrong, I still don't know. Some days I feel great about it. We got food to people who needed food, and sometimes I'm like, wow, I was a political tool.
And it's especially fraught, of course, because you are an American, and you get into that, especially in the first part of the book, describing how one of the ways that America reinforces its own narratives to its citizenry is one of fear and paranoia that, oh, other people want what you have and they want to take it from you, and there's eyes, there's lurking eyes everywhere, and so when you're traveling, you have to be highly suspect and skeptical. You, of course, walk us through it, like, it almost feels like funny and spontaneous and has a feel of fiction in many cases because of the way that you begin to let yourself kind of, not to be cliche here, but sort of go with the flow as things emerge. One instance in which in Somaliland leads you into a little bit of trouble. And I want to get there, but I also want to really take a moment to think about, or to have you process for us what it was like to be somebody traveling through these imaginary, or these countries that don't exist, as an American, which is part of the export of the Western world order, is America's idea of who gets to be a nation. And now and then this is sort of like crystallized in being an ambassador, like a sort of a two-way imaginary ambassador. How are you thinking about your role as an American person, and what you were thinking about your own, for your own identity, but also what you were communicating about America, what new forms of criticism you might have developed, what new ideas about all of these different things? I'd be really curious to hear what you learned and experienced.
I mean, I've spent, a decade, more or less. I was back in the States for about like 2 or 3 years. But for the better part of a decade, I've spent living abroad. And one of the things that I constantly think about, and I know this is not the same case for every American that lives abroad, is the longer I am abroad, the more American I actually feel, like the more aware of my Americanness I am. And I think that that's just because your culture becomes drawn into really sharp relief when you're outside of that culture. Like back in the States, like you can't really see the water that you swim in because the water is everywhere, right? And I touch on this issue of paranoia, and I started to think, why is that kind of a part of the American character? Because I do think it is, you know, it's a part of us, and I know it's deeply ingrained in my programming. And of course, bad things happen and have happened, while I've been traveling, but more often they don't. And one of the things that I've been really consistently surprised by is the grace with which I'm treated by people who have no reason to treat me that way. The many countries that I've been to that America has had violent conflict with, I've never once, felt preyed upon or less than due to my being an American. And I think that part of that is due to the fact that individuals who are living, let's say, in the Middle East, are very good at understanding that an individual is not their government. And I think oftentimes in the States we see ourselves as like this emissary of all that is American. And part of that is being an emissary of a pluralistic country. And so I've always been surprised how well I'm treated as an American, and that I don't need to do a lot of hemming and hawing and self-flagellation to be able to sit down and have tea with somebody. But it's also something that I hear from people who don't travel a lot is I'll mention, being in name a country, and somebody will be like, well, don't they all hate us there? It's like, like, first of all, they all is like a big thing. It's like, do like, 80 million Turks hate me? Probably not. I know some border guards that have some questions about what I've been up to. But yeah, no, they all don't hate us all. Granted, our government may have done things to their country that have resulted in a great deal of sorrow and heartbreak. The majority of my experience has been them seeing me as an individual and not, an American first and foremost. But when I think about my own self and the American character, it's like one of the things that consistently comes up is like, well, being American is a lot about independence and being a self-starter, and this idea that like if you're gonna make it, you're gonna make it on your own, and you're gonna do it through a bunch of gumption and maybe some, you know, ancestral wealth, but mostly gumption. And that's not a quality that's shared by every country in the world. And it's strange that people throughout the world are not like on this same like, well, I'm an entrepreneur and an actor and a model. Like not everybody is on that like I'm this sort of like Randian superhero thing that exists in the American complex. But the dark side of that is paranoia, right? Because if you're going on your own, then you're on your own, and you have to protect what's yours. And I think that I love that part about being an American, that like, there is this intrinsic belief that you on your own have the power to do something that you particularly think is great and worthy and important. And then I try to navigate the other side of it, which is, I'm paranoid of being kidnapped.
That's a wide spectrum.
It is a wide spectrum. Yeah. Very difficult.
Understood. So we've talked a little bit about we've kind of like zipped in and out of the journey in the book. But one aspect that comes up particularly in when you have gone to Kosovo, is your identity as a journalist.
Yeah.
And we get the early sort of sense of that when you're in Iraqi Kurdistan, predominantly because you're trying to have journalistic access to be able to observe what's going on because you're working on this book, which doesn't fit in the normal easy bucket of like, oh, you're a journalist at X publication. And so part of what we get in this book is the development of your identity as a journalist and what being a journalist specifically means to you. And there's this early flashpoint moment in Iraqi Kurdistan where you're like, oh, I shouldn't, wear this scarf with the Kurdish flag because I'm sort of violating some sense of objectivity that I'm supposed to hold even as an independent journalist. And yet I'm feeling swept up in this experience and wanting to enmesh myself in it fully as a gesture of ultimately returning a journalistic document. So how are you thinking about, like, when you look back at that time, what did you think being a journalist was? What do you think being a journalist is now? And what do you feel like you learned along the course of your travels?
Yeah, I mean, particularly with that moment, the moment was I was at a Kurdish rally, a rally for Kurdish independence, in Erbil for the president at the time, Masoud Barzani, and I was gaining access to it by going along with some people who are obviously in support. It's a political rally, and so somebody throws a scarf around your neck, and then I'm like, well, there kind of goes my neutrality in this, and then I realized that a lot of the experience wasn't about being a journalist for that exact event, right? What I was doing journalistically was talking about the feeling and the intoxication of experiencing nationalism, the sort of magic trick that can be played on all of us. And so within that moment, I think I say something along the lines of how people start calling out for President Barzani, and without realizing it, I realize I'm shouting the same chant, even though it's it's a chant in Kurdish, and I don't have a dog in this fight. And so the thing that I was fascinated with, and the thing that I really wanted to capture, was how anybody can just sort of be caught up in the throes of wanting to be a part of this one big voice that's shouting in one direction. And so, while I was reporting the facts that were going on, it wasn't about this one experience and reporting it like you would for Reuters. It's about reporting my internal experience of experiencing nationalism in the many different ways that it comes to you. Some of that's in the perplexing experience of being in the center of Kosovo and talking to a guy who's a Serbian docent at a monastery there, and hearing him tell me that Serbia will reclaim Kosovo at some point. And so I'm not reporting there, oh, this guy is a Serbian nationalist. Of course he is. What I'm reporting is his feeling and then my feeling of understanding that there are these two different stories that are hovering over this land, and watching them sort of duke it out for consensus reality.
Mm. Do you see yourself as a journalist now? Have you segued your professional identity elsewhere?
No, I mean, I see this book as a travel book, right? And ultimately, like the first goal of this book was one that I'm glad I didn't embark on. So the original goal of doing a travel book, other than just having an excuse to go places I wanted to go, which was the initial goal. But the first iteration of what this book was going to be, which is one of the things that brought me to Lebanon for the first time, was I wanted to write a non-political travel log of the Middle East, which you quickly realize is like writing Moby Dick without ever like using the word whale or like the word the or the letter A. Like you just can't, it's sort of impossible to separate the two. And I realized that that's also not a task that was for me specifically to do. So I wanted to write a travel log that was about places in the world that explored questions that I had. And so that's why I refer to this as a nonfiction book of travel, because ultimately what I hope is that it makes people want to travel more and makes people want to experience parts of the world that are not on the typical backpacker map, right? And to use travel as self-expression, right? Because that's ultimately what travel is. You know, you have a series of questions that can only be understood or solved or clarity can be brought to them by experiencing a certain place. And so one of the things that I was so curious about is, you know, how does nationalism move the human heart the way that it does? Because we experience this all the time in the United States. You're sort of looked at by how for or how against the concept of America you
Mm.
are. And that like broadly puts you into like one of two political buckets. But of course that's not the case. Like it's there's so many different shades of gray in this bell curve. So by experiencing places that didn't appear on maps, I was able to experience different types of nationalism and different types of patriotism. You know, the hope for a country that might exist on a map someday. The difficulties of trying to create a country, even though it's already been recognized by 100 different countries, and it's still not good enough.
Mm.
Like these are things that these are questions we're not burdened with in the United States. And then also the fact that, you know, I read a bit about the Soviet Union in there, and you don't realize how quickly the Soviet Union just went away one day. You know, within the space of a couple of years, it was just like, well, you know, I'm not a Soviet citizen anymore. Like, what am I? Yugoslavia, same way. And it's like, I'm not a Yugoslav citizen anymore, am I? And then turning that back on myself as an American, you know, if America goes away tomorrow, like, what am I? Like, am I a Californian? I live in Albania. I'm certainly not an Albanian. But like the way that our individual identity plugs into this bigger, greater thing, and that we, you know, get a part of, it was really exciting to me.
Mm.
So I in answer your question, like, do I call myself a journalist? Can be. Sometimes I am. Sometimes I write fiction. Really, I write whatever people are paying me for.
I really appreciate that answer. So with the show being called Urgent Futures,
Yeah.
I take a very broad view of what I mean by urgent. I don't just mean urgent in terms of sounding the alarm. Though of course there are many subjects that we should be sounding the alarm on. I think there can also be urgent play, urgent fun, urgent travel. In thinking about your own work, both as a writer, as somebody who's, you know, promoting the idea of travel, somebody who's surfacing complex ideas of what nationalism is and what nation states are, what do you see as urgent, and why have you chosen the sort of weird and winding path you've chosen? Like, what is that force that's animating you, that urgency?
I mean, I think that figuring out your relationship to your own national story and how much of your identity is dependent on your national story is something that we should all question a lot more, right? Just because it becomes that lever that can make us do things in for the better and for the worse. So I think that you know, I describe nation states as this invisible architecture of the world. Nation states are a concept that allows you to plug your own individual identity into something greater, and somehow that thing is a part of you. But I think that there's this double talk that happens sometimes where it's like, I'm an American. Yep, I landed on the moon and I invented the telephone or whatever. Like, but I never invaded Iraq. Like, it's like, no, you like both of those things are equally a part of your identity. The light and the shadow is a part of the identity that you have just by virtue of being born between some invisible lines. And I think that the more we cop to and look at what our national story is in broad daylight, the more that we can change that for the better. And the more that we can be insulated from having that become a lever that pushes us into a consensus reality that doesn't mirror our values.
Mm.
And I think so that's, and I also just, you know, I find like the illusion of nation states so fascinating. Like, and just the illusion of storytelling really fascinating. Like, I remember being in, like, I think fourth grade Catholic school, and like our mascot was like the Mariners, and it was like a bear with a little sailor hat on. And then when I found out that, like, there were other schools with other mascots, I was like, "Yeah, but theirs is worse." Like, where does this come from? Like, I have no idea. But, like, it is deeply human to sort of, like, believe in these galvanizing symbols. I just think that like any story, so much of it can be true. Like any other story, you can believe some to the absolute marrow of your bones, and you can dismiss other parts as, like, total hogwash.
Mm. Yeah, actually, on the bookshelf back there is The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David
Yeah.
Wengrow, and they talk about schismogenesis. So this
Yes.
this idea that we are there's something core in us that wants to differentiate. You sort of make fun of the word tribalism for, I think, very good reasons early in the book, but that we have this tribalistic impulse in many cases where we see what another group of people are doing and we say, no, we want to do something totally different.
Yeah.
Even if it's completely useless to me, I want to do it a different way, specifically to self-identify distinctly.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's that's what I call the magic trick of it. It's like, yeah, well, these people over here, all left-handed. You don't want to be them, do you? It's like, what are we talking about here? This is a completely arbitrary, non-moral distinction. But it's so important to the human mind, like, and so yeah, this concept of schismogenesis is like the idea that, like, your group identity is sometimes dictated by what you're not rather than what you are. There was this guy I met in northern Mitrovica, which is like, it's a divided city in Kosovo between the Serbian north and the Albanian speaking south. So you cross the bridge and you're basically, in a Serbian enclave there. And so I walked in and I was just, trying to make friends at a bar to get contacts there. And so I was talking with this one guy, and he asked me if I was Balkan, and I was like, no, why do you think that? And I was like, I had a drink and a cigarette, and he's like, well, you drink like a Russian and you smoke like a Turk and you look like a Jew, so you sure you're not Balkan? And I was like, wow, that was a lot of different identities that you just threw at me. And I was like, nope, I'm definitely not, but, like, let me buy you a drink. And he's like, I'm not gonna drink. I'm Muslim. I'm like, what's happening right now? And so he's this Bosnian Muslim guy that lives in northern Mitrovica, which is this Serbian stronghold. An individual that would, in some senses, be strange to find there because, of course, like, there was an ethnic cleansing on the Bosnian side during the fall of Yugoslavia. And so I was trying to have him help me tease apart, like, this Balkan identity, and he's like, "Well, a lot of the Balkan identity is based on knowing what you're not. Like, I'm not Catholic, I'm Muslim, which would make you think that I'm Albanian, but I'm not that. My father was Bosnian, so he says I'm Bosnian, and therefore I'm Bosnian. But I live in a Serbian area, and that Serbian area is within Kosovo." And I'm like, how do you keep it all straight? He's like, we don't. And it's like, so like this idea of identity being something that you do and something that you enact. Identity is also something that you know that you're not.
I feel like we didn't get to fully discuss the blockchain questions, and this is prompting me to want to go back there. I appreciate that you're somebody who has a storytelling background and can refer to past experiences that you've lived directly to discuss these ideas. But then when I met you, you worked at Cardano, and so you've had direct experience in this misunderstood sector of technology, misunderstood, perhaps correctly understood as a bad thing, perhaps maligned as if it's a good thing. I'd love to hear you, given what you've just outlined and thinking about values and the stories we're able to tell ourselves about ourselves, if you could kind of give us the bull's take on how blockchain and cryptocurrencies lead to liberatory, pro-social futures in the context of a nation state, and what's the bear's take?
Mm,
So
yeah.
you started talking about that earlier, but I want to go back there.
The best way I've heard blockchain described really is like this is a way of generating trust using math, right? And so that trust occurs on this immutable ledger. You know, we all know the elevator pitch for blockchain, and I won't bore everybody with that. But that's an important concept when you're talking about again galvanizing consent, right? So one of the things that I've thought about in terms of nation building, right, is you can almost think about nation building in the same way that you can think about a 51% attack, right? So if you garner 51% of the hashing power on a network, then suddenly you are able to determine what reality is on that network. And of course, it's through proof of work. But you can also consider a violent incursion into another nation where you're trying to change the consensus reality on the ground as almost a 51% attack, a 51% attack called proof of violence, right? So you're changing the consensus reality by using proof of something. So one way that a blockchain-based future could be helpful is by creating a level monetary playing field for everybody, so that we withdraw the ability to have to wield this huge fiscal hammer that's based in one nation state. And of course, the United States is not the first country in the world to have that hammer, right? You know, before us it was the British Empire, and before them probably like Spain or somebody. I don't know.
It's been lots of
It
people.
was Portugal at one point, I'm pretty sure. And then we wanted spices or something. I'm great at history. Anyway, so like I like that idea about that no one nation has the power to completely economically disenfranchise another country. I think creating level playing fields is consistently a good thing for the world. The other thing is like as far as creating a single source of truth for actual held data. This withdraws power from central media apparatuses that have the ability to skew whatever story on the ground is. So that's potentially a good thing. I think everything that makes a blockchain-based future good has to do with transparency, reliability, and the ability for everybody to access the same thing. Because there isn't digital parity across the world. And, you know, somebody in Palo Alto?
Mhm.
Yeah. Somebody in Palo Alto is making tons of money off of people in Ghana. Like that's not a level playing field. And I think that the world will be a better place if there was a level playing field. However, I don't think that that's the future that would end up emerging because of course the first movers in this field are people who have generated an enormous amount of centralized power themselves, right? I mean, I don't remember the exact percentage, but I know over 60% of the Bitcoin blockchain is controlled by what, like 6 or 7, pools.
Mm.
That's centralization. So it's tending more towards centralization, and power, wealth, and attention usually do that. It ebbs and flows between centralization and decentralization. Are we entering an environment where we have just new people who are now in control of the resources of the world and the attention of the world and the power of the world? Potentially. It can certainly move a lot faster and it cares less for borders. So, I mean, those are the two futures. One of the more hopeful things that I've heard was from a scientist that was working on the last crypto project that I was a part of. He said that part of what's interesting about using cryptocurrencies and using blockchains to move the world forward is that you can create a bloodless revolution by just creating a parallel system that works better. So people will naturally, through their own incentives, move on to this new system if it works better, right? And if it's not as full of perverse incentives as the legacy financial system is. That hasn't happened yet. I would love it if it did. Blockchain technology is still in its infancy, and we'll see if it's able to contain the demons that are within an incredibly powerful tool. But I don't know at this point. Yeah. And the other question is like, what's the alternative, right? Do you see another nation state creating, wielding that hammer of finance across the world, and the world becoming a better, more equal, more egalitarian place? I don't know. Hasn't worked so far.
Well, it'll be
But
fascinating.
to the moon, right?
Lambos.
Hey, everybody gets Lambos.
Cue Oprah meme.
That's right. You get a Lambo.
Well, I appreciate that outlining of the Bulls and Bears take.
I think you can gauge someone's general ignorance and indoctrination to a concept based upon how many of the world's wicked problems will be solved by something that benefits them specifically.
Mm.
Right? It's like, oh man, Bitcoin made me rich. Now we're gonna solve hunger. What? How did we? And then I'm gonna get richer by solving hunger. How did we get there?
Yeah, it's I'm still very excited by a lot of the ideals, and I very much agree with the possibilities that you outlined.
Which of those do you see as more possible, or am I missing one that is there a third future in there that I'm missing?
I mean, inevitably, the whole classic thing of like the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Sure.
And I think we're still in the moment, not only with blockchain being young, but I think it's still treated as a novelty and therefore not taken seriously in either direction. It's either not taken seriously as just a speculative vehicle for generating obscene wealth for individuals willing to take on a high degree of personal risk, or it's seen as a total scam and a fraud, and you're the dumb one left holding the bag type of thinking. And it's very hard to find, these sort of takes that are in the middle that acknowledge what the occasion of blockchain means, the ways it allows people to simply reflect on whatever abstract paradigm they're currently in. If it's just purely Bitcoin and it's a currency question, it's what is legitimating the currency that you're currently using? And perhaps you shouldn't just be relying on that base assumption. If it's, speaking for myself, like from the Protocol Lab side, if it's storage, are you comfortable storing your precious files on Amazon Web Services servers? Are you comfortable storing things on Google Drive? Like, these are providing very convenient services. I use them. I'm not saying that I don't, but you're inherently letting go of a certain degree of sovereignty in doing that, because of course those files are, first of all, they're hoovering up any sort of economic value to a very high degree. But then secondly, in the case of your data, it might be the case that your data is being used to train some model. So thinking about a decentralized storage paradigm becomes very important if you're like, oh, I don't want to be part of training data, or I want to be part of a peer-to-peer network of storage in which I actually have faster, I can get that data faster, I can trust that it's more reliable, I can choose how redundant I want to make that data. And so those types of use cases, getting back to your earlier point about the less sexy it is, I really resonated with that, because ledger technology is not exciting on its face. And I think that there's this dance of using the financial aspects to make it exciting, but then the financial aspects become all anybody talks about. And so when I think about what's the future, I think we're going to still see this back and forth swing. We're talking in early December 2023. We're in the midst of possibly a new bull run, or possibly, I forget what the terminology is, but basically like pumping the market.
Bitcoin go up.
Right, Bitcoin go up, but in order to, sort of reset the market. And so I think that dynamic is going to keep playing out. My hope is that as that dynamic's playing out, and as it's either obscene wealth or the crash and the scam, we're going back forth, that within that, some of the really viable use cases and the aspects that can interfere with what's not working in current consensus realities can start to be addressed, or at least reimagined. And maybe it's the case that blockchain technologies, all they're meant to do ultimately not meant to do. I don't want to have like a teleological sort of approach to it, but maybe all the good that they bring to the world is that they cause people to reevaluate. But then, cryptocurrencies die off and everybody stops using blockchain, and there's some other, decentralized technology that sort of rises and becomes interesting to people.
In terms of blockchain-based infrastructure, some infrastructure is visible. The Golden Gate Bridge, visible, so visible. That's a thing, but it also has a distinct purpose. People are over there; they got to get over there. But then there's a lot of infrastructure that's totally invisible, and that's some of the most important infrastructure we have. Plumbing. Like I want a blockchain future where blockchain is plumbing, because nobody is ever talking about they're using the internet and being like, man, I used TCP/IP today. It's like no, nobody cares, right? It's just the a more robust network that allows you to maintain more control of your power, attention, and wealth, right? And that's the future that I think would be the most beneficial, where you don't have the people who can leverage an enormous amount of attention pumping and dumping cryptocurrencies that were never meant to solve any problems. Like, blockchain will mature based upon the problems that it has solved, and it's solved very few big problems at this point. So I hope it solves more.
I agree.
That'd be cool.
So now is the lightning round recurring questions section of the episode.
How long have you been a member of the Communist Party? Shit.
Got me. What is one resource you recommend for making sense of reality?
Okay, this is one that I make use of constantly. And I don't mean to like Tim Ferriss this, because it's not like, a website or an app or anything. Just ask dumb questions. Just ask dumb questions constantly. I think that the more we all collectively are able to, bear the burden of not knowing everything, the more that we'll all operate on the same page more often. Like the media landscape that we operate in right now basically optimizes for assumption of knowledge and speed with which you can say that knowledge. And knowledge doesn't come quickly, at least not knowledge that's worth having, right? And so some of the dumb questions that I love is like, why is that country shaped like that? Why do you, why do you take off your shoes indoors? How do you get to work every day? I mean, and there's also this other thing that I think is sort of shunned in the West, which is asking questions honestly about other people's culture. Culture is a robust thing. It won't break if you handle it. Like, if you ask somebody an honest question about their culture, about their background, or about their heritage, more often than not, I found that people are more than happy to share that with you. I've had people be offended for other people based upon like asking a question out of cultural ignorance, but like that's the way you get out of ignorance, is by asking stupid questions and be willing to be the dimwit in the room, right? And you're always like 2 to 3 questions away from like making a really good personal connection with somebody.
Related to that, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Infrastructure. Like, man, if you live in a place, and I hope you do, where like you've got running water and the lights go on, and like, man, if you have hot and cold running water, are you kidding? That's great. Infrastructure is again, it's something that like, it's the water that we swim in culturally, and it's also not something that we recognize how many people are without on a consistent basis. And infrastructure is not just, the streets that you walk on are clean and safe. It's also cultural infrastructure. Some cultural infrastructure is, again, it's like, it goes back to like, I feel that it is okay to learn more about somebody else's culture by asking them questions about it. That's cultural infrastructure, curiosity. being self-driven, understanding that you don't know a lot about the world and that you want to learn more. All of those things are cultural infrastructure. And also, like, stoplights fucking rule. Oh, there's so many, man, the amount of times that my life has flashed before my eyes because I was crossing a street. Wow. Like in Somaliland, they have English side cars, but they drive on the right side of the road. It is wild. Go hug a stop sign. Infrastructure.
Shout out infrastructure.
Shout out plumbing. Holy shit. I mean, literally. Oh my God. Plumbing's amazing.
All right. Well, great to hear it.
Bridges. Love them. Elevators. Escalators that work. Oh, even when they don't, pretty good. Still stairs.
Just with the little striations.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what is one time your sense of reality was disrupted?
So this book was basically dead in probably 2019. So I had finished writing most of the book and gone through the various phases of getting agents and talking with publishers. We were working on a documentary series about the book. And I was quickly informed that basically no publishers wanted it. The documentary series was canceled due to COVID. And I was left with this sort of stack of pages that took me a year and a half and quite a few near brushes with death to write. And I was sort of resigning myself to the fact that, like, this was just going to be a weird bar story for me to have. And that was more or less a waste of my year. As a part of that, I had this weird experience of just, even after I'd been a writer my entire life, I just couldn't write anymore because this one most important project to me was not wanted by anybody in the entire world, as far as I was concerned. Because, traditional publishing didn't want it, and because, we weren't doing a documentary series about it. And so it sort of lived in the back of the drawer, and then I realized I had this huge problem of, like, I can't write anymore. Because the one thing I want to say, I can't say. And so I went on this sort of, eat, pray, love journey to try and learn how to write again. And, I sequestered myself in a cabin for a month and then came out, and then it was COVID. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that happened. And then I went to South Africa. I was going to an 11-day meditation retreat. And then I was just hanging out in Cape Town for a while. And things were sort of beginning to start again. I was able to chip away at completing this book. And I was hiking one day outside of Table Mountain, which, hiking in Cape Town, around Cape Town, is not known as, like, the most safe activity unless it's like a heavily trafficked trail. And this trail was heavily trafficked, and they said, it's probably fine to go hiking there. But it wasn't. So I was ambushed by a gentleman while I was hiking, and I was attacked. And he, wanted my stuff, and I disagreed about who should own my things. And so I was attacked, and I ran from him, and I was running as fast as I could, but I was going down a mountain, so I fell, rolled down the mountain, and my glasses were gone. And essentially I was like an upturned turtle that was blind at the same time at this point. And I had assumed that my attacker would go away at that point just because I had made a big enough noise. And I looked back, and he was coming towards me with a knife still. And I hadn't realized at this point, but he had cut me across the head. After many brushes with my mortality, some of which are in the book here, I just kind of felt like I was out of luck this time. And I didn't think I was gonna make it out of this one because, yeah, I was blind, and a man with a knife is coming towards me, and time was sort of slowing down as this was happening, and I didn't have this experience of my life flashing before my eyes or any of that, though that would have been really cool. What sort of came to the forefront immediately as this was happening was just this huge regret that I had that this book never came out. And I've done pretty good not having a ton of regrets. I've gotten to do some really neat shit in my life, and so it was it was insane how this was just sort of ringing in my head as I was watching a guy with a knife, approach me. And I was like, well, whoever's listening, I'm gonna get this book out if I get through this. And so he came around, and you can read about it in the book, but we ended up fighting one another. And I was able to get away, albeit covered in blood, and minus a couple of my items, but I was able to get away. And the next day I took this manuscript out and I was like, well, like, I don't care. Publishers don't want it. I don't care if anybody's making a documentary about it. I don't care about any of that. I'm putting the book out myself. My mom's an author too. And I think the best piece of advice that she's ever given me about writing is the word fuck 'em. They don't like it, fuck 'em. They don't want to publish it, fuck 'em. They didn't like that page, fuck 'em. And so I thought, fuck 'em, put it out myself. And I'm really glad that I did. And, in like, that was a really shitty thing to happen. But honestly, I'm really grateful that it did, because I don't think that this book would have happened without him.
Well, in a weird way then, thank you, nameless attacker.
Patrick was his name.
Oh, you knew his name?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
On that note.
Yeah, so check out You Are Not Here, Travels Through Countries That Don't Exist by me, Eric Czuleger. It's spelled C as in cat, Z as in zebra, Uleger. And you can find it on Amazon. The audiobook is coming shortly. So
Are you narrating it?
I am, yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
That'll be fun.
I think it'll be out in the next week or two. So yeah. You're not the first to say that it sounds a lot like how I talk.
But I had a really, really fun time reading it, and I feel like there's so much for people to learn about the modern state of the nation state, and also a fun travelogue.
It's a wild thing to start thinking about, and that's the most fun to me, is that, like, you get to kind of question everything. And it's like, oh, what's a country? Again, dumb question. Ask dumb questions. Such a dumb one. Got a book out of it.
Cheers to that.
Yeah.
It's available on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And where can people find you?
Okay. So on Instagram is probably my best venue. If you come to Albania, let me know. I live in Tirana. I also have just started doing my speculative fiction podcast again. So check out Howl, Strange Short Fiction for a Strange Short Existence. And I have 2 other books that are all speculative fiction. So check those out. Yeah, Twitter, X, it's all Czuleger.
Cool.
Yeah.
And I realized I forgot to ask, are there any books on the horizon you can share with us?
I think I'm going back to writing some speculative fiction right now.
Excellent.
I'm also making a coloring book for the occult, 'cause it's just fun. And I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about this yet, but I'll let you know. I think I can talk about it. So I'm working on a sort of bigger project of starting a country. I'll leave it at that, though.
Mic drop.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Urgent Futures. I really appreciate your time.
Glad to be here, man. This is awesome.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.